So what I will present today will be very much based on research that we conducted in different European projects, namely the EuroCap project that took place from 2002 to 2005 and 6 actually, the CapRide project from 2010 to 2007 to 2010, and the Workable project that took place from 2009 to 2012, and also the ongoing Society project, let's say, from 2013 to 2015. And so I will, in all these projects, we try to apply the capability approach to social policies in OECD countries, obviously, because the partner countries in all these projects were EU countries or Switzerland in my case. And so I will try to show you why we try to use the capability approach, what is the relevance of the capability approach, at first in rather general terms, and then I will try to show you some more examples, more detailed and concrete examples of what the capability approach can bring to the study and the analysis of social policies. So the first slide is about social policies and the relevance of the capability approach to study and analyze social policies in the field in OECD countries. When we speak about social policies, we have always to remind that there is an inherent ambivalence within social policies. They both bring resources, they bring benefits to the beneficiaries of social policies, they bring access to services, be it education, training programs, or healthcare, or whatsoever, but they also social policies are also constraining. They constrain people, they have to abide by certain conditions, they have to accept certain behavioral norms, if you want, in order to have access to these resources, benefits, services, and all these kind of things. So there is an inherent ambivalence within social policies. They both enable people, and I want to insist on this because we had a question on this in the last session. So they also provide resources, they have an empowering aspect, these social policies, but they also constrain people and they somehow impose on people some specific norms. You cannot get access to benefits, services like this freely if you do not accept to abide by certain norms or certain conditions. There is always a cost to access to social policies. This is the first ambivalence that I wanted to emphasize in this presentation. The second one is related to the issue of the entanglement of facts and values. The social policies, there are some currents of analysis of social policies that insist that they are like evidence-based policies, which means that you have to study the facts of inequalities, the facts of disadvantage, of poverty, exclusion, and all these kind of things. And when you have very well studied the facts, then the policy will derive, so to say, automatically from the facts. So we are in the realm of facts, not in the realm of values, and we have just to focus on facts, on evidence-based facts and evidence-based policies. And I think this obviously does not hold. Politics is about choices, about choice of values, choice of norms, all these kind of things. And so when we study social policies, we have to take on board these two issues, facts, of course, about poverty, social exclusion, socio-demographic facts whatsoever, but also values and political choices that are at the very core of public policies. And so we need to have an approach that allows to grasp the ambivalence of social policies, that are both enabling and constraining, and that are both facts and values. And what we try to emphasize in the various projects that I've mentioned before is that the capability approach allows to capturing this ambivalence between enabling and constraining, because as you know, this issue of capabilities, at the very core of capabilities, you have the issue of the real freedom to lead the life one has reason to value. So to what extent is this freedom real? This is the empowerment issue, if you want. To what extent do social policies empower their beneficiaries to lead a life they have reason to value? So what is the effect of social policies on their opportunity sets? This is the first issue. And the second issue is about to what extent are people emancipated, or to what extent do social policies promote the autonomy of people, or on the contrary, do they constrain people. So to what extent are people's aspirations taken seriously within the implementation of social policies? So if you take the first line of ambivalence of social policies, this line between enabling and constraining, the capability approach allows to capture both sides of it, both the enabling side and the constraining side of social policies. And this is, in my view, quite different, let's say, from what we can see in functionalist approaches, because functionalist approaches tend to think that social policies respond to the needs of the people, and so that they are always favorable to people, and that they have a very positive view of social policies. And they forget the negative side, the more constraining side, if you want. And you have, on the other side, very critical approaches to social policies that are overcritical and that focus on the contribution of social policies to social order, to the maintenance of social norms or the implementation of social norms. And so these very negative approaches to social policies tend to forget the positive, the empowering side of social policies. While the capability approach, this is what we contend in this project, allows implementing both, taking account of both these dimensions. And then the capability approach is not about facts, because as you know, this has been emphasized repeatedly by Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum, that the descriptions of social problems is also an issue of choice. So you can describe social problems around in many ways. You can choose to describe the violence of young people, for example, by focusing on certain aspects of it or by focusing on other aspects of it. So you have different informational bases when you describe a social problem. And this is very important to know that when you design a social policy or a public policy, you focus on one informational basis and you discard the other ones. And so there is a valuational exercise, a valuational exercise when you design public policies. It's not a matter of fact, it's a matter also of values when you choose what objective facts will be considered as relevant, which will be informing the objective of public policies. And this is, of course, contrary or different from a positivistic approach to social policies that would say we are not concerned by values, we are concerned only with facts. Values are not our problem. We are scientifics. We are serious people. So we do not consider in any way the values that are at the core of social policies. If you endorse this kind of vision of positivistic approach to social policies, in my view, it means that somehow you consider that the values that are at the core of social policies are not disputed, and you consider as if they were valid. If you consider that values are at the core of the empirical investigation, then you have an empirical investigation that focuses on both sides of it, on facts and values. So again, the capability approach allows to have a more balanced view of social policies, focusing on both facts and values. And last thing that is important is that the capability approach is not only an analytical tool. The point is not only to analyze public policies and social policies, it's also to assess them, to try to see what is their value, how to evaluate these policies. And it gives a normative yardstick to assess these policies, and this normative yardstick is namely the issue of capabilities. So to what extent do social policies contribute to the enhancement of people's real freedom to lead a life they have reason to value? And in our different project, we use this with regard to two notions: capability for work. So to what extent do social policies enhance the real freedom to people to have a job they have reason to value, and maybe not only to have a job, but to have a life more widely they have reason to value. And the second issue was the issue of capability for voice. So to what extent are the beneficiaries of social policy allowed to have their say, to express their wishes, to express their expectations when a social policy is designed or when it is implemented? Is the implementation of social policies done against the people or with them, in collaboration with them? And if you take on board all these things, then you can build a kind of critical view on social policy, but critical not in a destructive conception of critical, but in a kind of more taking some distance from social policies, to have an analytical look, to have an assessing look, and maybe to contribute to the enhancement of social policies. And this is more or less what we try to do and we are still trying to do in these projects that I mentioned. And now I will just apply this very general and very abstract framework to three issues and three kinds of resources that we investigated in our projects. So three kinds, we can say very roughly, that there are three kinds of resources that can be provided by social policies. And all these resources are ambivalent. They are empowering, enabling, but at the same time, they are constraining. And so I will give you some hints about these resources, these categories of resources. The first one is resources for material well-being. As you know, social policies provide benefits, cash benefits to their beneficiaries, and so if they lose their job, if they lose their income from coming from a job, they may have some replacement income and they may get access to another kind of income, to some replacement money, if you want. And the evolutions that we can observe in the last years concerning these resources for material well-being, they are twofold, we could say. The first one is that the access to these resources is increasingly conditional, which means that at first you had, so to say, eligibility conditions that were imposed. You had to pay your contributions, and if you had paid your contribution, you had access to benefits. Now you have also behavioral conditions that are imposed, which means that you have to accept, to abide by these behavioral conditions if you want to have access to cash benefits. So not only eligibility conditions, but conditions to maintain benefit entitlements. And this, of course, may lead to sanctions, which means that people who do not abide by this kind of behavioral conditions, they can lose their rights, their benefit entitlements. So in terms of access to resources for material well-being, in terms of the enabling part of social policies, quite clearly you can see that there are some issues, there are at least two issues that ought to be emphasized here. The first one is that for people who are inside social policies, the constraints become stronger, tighter, because you have behavioral constraints that you did not have before. So for those who are inside, stronger constraints. And then you have something that can be observed, and that a lot of work, for example, by Philippe Varin, a very famous French politist, I think, has shown that the issue of non-take-up, which means people who do not take the right to their benefits, they do not take their benefits, they choose not to take their benefits, or they don't know how to get to their benefits, or they don't know they're entitled to it. This issue of non-take-up is getting more and more important. There are more and more people within OECD countries that do not take their rights to benefit, to cash benefits, to benefit entitlement. So this is an issue that is very important. And this is a very complex issue, because in capability terms, it means that there are some people who cannot have the same rights, or who cannot be enabled or empowered to the same extent as other people. And it means also that there are people who think, and not that few, but quite a lot, a significant number of them, who think that the constraints attached to social policies are big enough to make them renounce to ask for these benefits. So in capability terms, you have these two problems. The conditions imposed are very strong, very tight, and so this, of course, has consequences in terms of real freedom to choose, taking account of people's aspirations, and you have also the issue of access to benefits that gets more complicated than before. If I take the second issue linked to these resources for material well-being, the second issue is linked to the issue of the amount of these resources and the duration of these resources. And in many countries, you can see a tendency that is quite variable in all countries, but a tendency to the reduction of the amount that is paid to beneficiaries and of the duration where they can count, they can rely on benefits. And this means that you have a change in value of the link between passive empowerment, what I call passive empowerment here, which means what the state gives you without your direct control, freedom without direct control. You may remember Sen's presentation about this, how he presents this idea. It means kind of passive freedom. I have access to education, to educational system, to healthcare, without my being responsible for this access. So passive empowerment, and the effect of passive empowerment on active freedom. And there is a whole discussion and debate that revolves around this issue, and you have many, many interpretations that are possible, but I will just mention three here. The first one insists on the incompatibility between the two interpretations. So if you give too much, or in certain very radical cases, if you give passive benefits, if you give unconditional access to cash benefits, then people will not be pushed to be actively responsible for themselves. So there is a kind of incompatibility, and if you want to make people more empowered, you have to reduce the benefits, or maybe, for the more radical cases, maybe to eliminate them. You see, and this is, of course, the neoliberal view, what we call the neoliberal shift in social policies that took place from the beginning of the 80s, but it was not fully implemented, to say the least. So the first vision, incompatibility between the two. Then you have a second vision that is defended, or that is pushed by the defenders of what we call the social investment state, which means that we need to reform the welfare state to focus on expenditure that can be deemed as productive. It means education, training, childcare. Childcare can be productive because it frees the time of mothers in order to let them go to work. So we can focus on these kind of resources, and all the other kinds of resources, pension benefits and all these kind of things, are deemed as unproductive. So we should say that social policies ought to be developed according to this productive aspect, and the other aspect, unproductive, passive benefits, should be, let's say, more or less neglected or discarded. And then you have another vision of this, and I think this would be more in line with the vision that is purported by the capability approach, that says that freedom without direct control, passive empowerment, is necessary to promote and to push active freedom. There is no individual responsibility without social support, social collective responsibility support to promote this responsibility. And so you have a kind of more equilibrated, let's say, vision of the relationship that can take place between passive empowerment, what is given by the state, and individual responsibility, the ability of people to take their fate, their destiny, or their future in their hands. And so you can see that according to the value, this valuational exercise, the way you will tackle this valuational exercise, you will have a very different view of how resources for material well-being should be redistributed or not. And clearly, for me, at least in my view, the capability approach would go in the third direction. This was for the first resources, the first category of resources. So the second category of resources is what I call here resources for agency. These resources, quite the contrary from the resources for material well-being, these resources in OECD countries have been very significantly developed and increased in the last 10 to 15 years. So you have much more expenditure, public expenditure, about activation programs, training, education for unemployed people, for disabled, rehabilitation programs, trying to push these people back to the labor market. But the issue is much more complicated than this. If you look only in terms of amounts, on quantity of programs and services that are offered, clearly there is an increase, and a very significant increase. But what we have to tackle, the issue we have to tackle, and what we need to keep in mind is the issue of value. What kind of agency is considered as valuable? What kind of agency will be promoted by activation programs that you can find in the form of training programs, subsidized job, and all these kind of things. And I just want here to emphasize some problems, some evolutions, let's say recent evolutions, that may be problematic in terms of capabilities. First, in activation programs, the objective is to put people back to work. And so the objective somehow is self-sufficiency of people through their position and their integration in the labor market. If they go back to the labor market, they will be considered as self-sufficient, self-sufficient being defined in most cases as independency from the state. We are no more dependent from the state, we do no more receive welfare benefits, so we are independent. This is a conception of self-sufficiency that is quite problematic. I would say that we just here mentioned two problems, two possible problems, but of course we can mention many, many others. The first one is it might convey the impression that people can get autonomous on their own, which means that we are kinds of, or people that are activating are kinds of Superman that can get their own living autonomously, and they do not need others. And so you would have here, if such is the case, you would have a kind of anthropology that would be against an vulnerability of man that needs others, that needs care, or that needs these kind of things. You know, a kind of very powerful man that can get everything on his own, provided he is or she is on the labor market. So not a relational view of capabilities, but a kind of atomistic and very individualistic view of capabilities. This might be one problem. The second one, in my view, is still more important. Is the risk, what we call here the risk of selectivity, which means that if the objective is to go back to the labor market, self-sufficiency, and try to be competitive, as competitive as possible on this labor market, is this objective reachable by all beneficiaries of social policies? I think in all countries where we conducted our studies, we can see that this objective is not reachable by all people. There are some people that stay outside the labor market for a very long time. And so there is a risk of selectivity if we focus on employability, self-sufficiency, and all these kind of things. It means that there is a risk of what we call a Matthew effect. Maybe you know this expression, which means to those who have already a lot, we still give more. So activation programs for those who would need them less, and for the others, long-term unemployment or these kind of things. And this is something that we can see and we can witness in many countries. I don't say that all activation programs are subject to this kind of perverse effects, but quite a lot of them go in these directions. And in this case, you could say that social policies are not there to reduce inequalities, to tackle the issue of inequalities, but rather to reinforce inequalities. And this is something that I would say, unfortunately, you can observe quite often. So first concern, let's say, and again, I do not say that all activation policies go in this direction, but this is a risk that is linked to activation programs. The second one is activation and agency are clearly very much linked to the issue of integration into the labor market, which means that what is considered, the kind of agency that is considered as valuable is the inclusion in the labor market. And all other kinds of agency that would focus on the issue of capability for work and life, that would try to develop other kinds of activities that maybe are not solvable in terms of the labor market because they cannot receive wages, they have much more difficulties to find their place in this activation model. If the activation is about going back to the labor market, there is space for it, no problem. If the activation is about developing some association or these kind of things, that is much more problematic. The labor market is considered very often, not always again, but very often, as the ultimate goal of activation. So activation, agency, in activation, agency is considered as being a worker, a producer, if you want, on the labor market in many, many cases. Not in all cases, I try to repeat here. And then, last point that I want to emphasize concerning this issue of resources for agency, is that it very much focuses on individual conversion factor, what some people call supply-side fundamentalism. The important is to equip people, to educate them, to train them. It can be their own responsibility if you insist that they are individual entrepreneurs, or it can be a joint responsibility if you insist that the state also has a collective responsibility to educate people. But the focus very often is on supply-side adaptability, to adapt people, to equip people for the market. And there is much less focus on the other way around, what Bernard Gazier, for those of you who know him, would say, to equip markets for the people. So to try to change not only the individual conversion factors, but also the social conversion factors and the ways of working, of functioning of the market. In terms of the market, I just mentioned here two things that I will be very quick on this. The first issue is if we think that people need to have jobs, and this is the purpose of activation, does the market provide enough jobs for everyone? This is not clear at all. Even in Switzerland, where the situation is very good, we have a structural 15 to 20% of people who do not succeed to get in the labor market. And I think that most of you who are here would say, but this would already be a wonderful achievement to go in this direction. So can the market clear? I'm not sure at all that the market alone can clear. It does not mean that the market does not give any good solution, but by itself, it is not sure at all that the labor market, as it works now, can clear and can offer jobs for everyone. And then there is, of course, the huge issue of the quality of jobs, because we could integrate many, many people, but in any kinds of jobs. This is a kind of rhetoric that we saw in many countries. Bad job is better than no job at all. And so this issue of the quality of jobs seems to be quite difficult. And so there is a kind of reflection to know how to create enough jobs. I think the capability approach does not say much in this direction. And there is a kind of reflection to say how we can provide qualitative jobs of good quality. And I think we have also to rely on other approaches to think about this. But the issue can be raised by the capability approach, and these kind of issues are not necessarily raised by other approaches. I want now to be very quickly on the third kind of resources that I want to present here. These are resources for participation. Resources for agency, I very much focused on what is done to adapt people to the context. Now, this was very much an issue of adaptability. If you talk about resources for participation, it means what is done to allow people, or maybe to promote their capacity to participate in the fabric, in the social fabric, to participate in the way things should be done, to be democratic citizens, if you want. If you look within the field of social policies, within the implementation of social policies, there are some issues that we need to take into account. It's, first of all, what kind of objectives are given to social policies. If these are very precise and very restrictive objectives, there will be very little space for interpretation or negotiation of these objectives, taking into account the position of the beneficiaries. If the objectives are larger, for example, enhancing capabilities, then, of course, there might be some more space concerning this issue of participation. So this is an issue that is very important. What kind of objectives are there? What kind of managerial tools are used to monitor public policies and to monitor the efficiency of social policies? And then, recently, a lot of new tools have been used by social workers trying to promote an active behavior of the beneficiaries, which means trying to promote that the beneficiaries become actors of their activation. Not only that they are submitted to the activation requirements, but they become actors of the activation. And there is the notion of project, the notion of contract, autonomy. These are notions that are more and more increasingly present in the field of social policy. But I must say that these notions, the use of this notion is very ambivalent, which means that when you talk about contract, very often the contract is something that is drawn and designed by the social worker and signed by the beneficiary. When you talk of project, it has always to be a realistic and a project that is conform, that corresponds to the principle of reality. And who decides what reality is? Usually not the beneficiary, but the institutional representative. And so they very often say that our first task is to cool down the aspirations of beneficiaries, trying to make them realistic in our conception of what realistic is. We have to bring them to think the way we think they should think. So this is in terms of capabilities. This, of course, raises some issues. This is within social policies, and outside social policies, as I've said, I will be very, very quick here. The main objective in many activation programs is rather to produce good workers, good let's say, productive and competitive people that can go in the labor market, and not really to produce citizens that can participate in democratic debates and these kind of things. Maybe it's not the place of social policies to do this, so I will not say that there is nothing that happens concerning this point, but not, at least not, or very, very rarely in the field of social policies. And this maybe opens up some way for a place of a researcher that could promote what Sen calls the constructive dimension of democracy, and maybe give more weight to the voice of the weakest, of the most disadvantaged, of those who are more or less voiceless in the field of social policies. What we try to do in our research is to try to investigate what are the aspirations, the needs. This is also one part of our project. What are the aspirations, the wishes, the expectations of the beneficiaries of social policies, and what could be done in order that these aspirations are taken on board when we design and when we implement social policies. So a kind of a new function, if you want, of researchers in social science or in economic science or whatsoever, that would be a kind of promoter of constructive democracy, a kind of someone that would carries the views and the information that is of the beneficiaries in the field of the design and implementation of social policies. Okay, if you take these three categories of resources and you take on board the questions that I tried to very quickly tackle here, you can see that the capability approach could be used to let's say, implement the three dimensions of what could be called the critical social policy. It gives the analytical tools to take on board both the enabling and the constraining dimensions, both facts and values. It also allows assessing, so there is a normative moment in the capability approach that allows assessing policies, showing what is good. Maybe I did not insist enough on this, but also showing what could be improved. And there is also a political moment where the researcher could be a kind of informant trying to improve democracy and improve the informational base of democracy. And this is more or less the objectives that we try to pursue within our projects. Okay, thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Jean-Michel. Thank you for this very stimulating presentation. I think it's quite clear why you try to use the capability approach as a yardstick to assess social policies, and in which way you intend to implement it. Benedict, you also developed from 2000 onwards a series of inquiries on the capability approach, and you also develop a sociology of capability. Do you share the same vision than Jean-Michel? Do you have some comments on this presentation? So the floor is yours for 10 minutes now.
So rich presentation. So it makes the task very difficult for me now to discuss presentation with so many different aspects. So I will focus the discussion on the critical potential the capability approach may bring to the study of social policies. So it makes easier for me to have such a focus. Jean-Michel addressed this critical potential during all his talk, but I would like now to address it more directly. Because I would ask Jean-Michel about the kind of critical stance that he's thinking about when he's speaking about capabilities as a critical yardstick. So what does it involve? It's specific kind of critical posture. I had the luck to read one of his texts where he's a little bit more explicit about this. And Jean-Michel refers himself to the tradition of the critical theory of the Frankfurt School, namely represented by Horkheimer's work. And I would like to introduce into the discussion another way of developing critical discussion on social policies, namely paths that it's driven from critical pragmatism as referred to the work of John Dewey. What is the main difference between these two positions? I think that the first one, the position of the critical theory is to use a normative yardstick that is defined, chosen by the researcher, and that is not necessarily integrated into the field of research. Whereas the leading line of the second approach of the critical pragmatism is to use an internal yardstick. That means normative concepts that are at stake and at use in the specific subject matter that one is studying. And the hypothesis I would like to discuss here, and I'm wondering if you would share it, is that the capability approach actually stands at the crossroad between these two approaches, or that the capability approach allows to bridge these two different critical approaches that for a long time have been whether antinomic. I mean, the Frankfurt School, the founders of the Frankfurt School considered Dewey just as a positivist. You spoke about positivist at the beginning of your speech. And they denied him any critical approach, whereas for Dewey, really, the critical potential of the social sciences was in the practice of the empirical inquiry. So, why do I consider that the capability approach can be considered at the crossroad between these two approaches? Because the capability offers a normative concept in relation with the principle of justice, namely equal freedom to achieve. So this can be considered as an external yardstick, whatever the subject matter and whatever the field of study. And insofar, it can be used as a critical approach for people who are referring themselves to the critical theory of the Frankfurt School. But at the same time, capability is a descriptive concept. It is concerned with opportunities, with resources, with values, with conversion factors. And so far, it allows to conceptualize and to put under the test of reality the main founding concepts of current social policies, namely individual responsibility, empowerment, you spoke about it, and even freedom. Well, I would say some more words about this critical pragmatist approach, because the first approach has already been developed by Jean-Michel. And I would like to focus on two aspects to illustrate the potential of the critical pragmatism for the capability approach. The first concern is the entanglement between facts and value. And the second concern, maybe I'm already, yeah, it's here. And the second concern is the logic of inquiry. And these are really for me, two shared concerns between, on the one side, the capability approach, and on the other, pragmatism. And now I have a question to Jean-Michel regarding the question of the entanglements of facts and values. If one wants to research on this kind of entanglement and to know more about this, then he needs to have an empirical design in order to address values. And this is a real challenge for the capability approach as well as for pragmatism. But my idea is that pragmatism here can help us in order to develop such an empirical design for studying values in a more sophisticated way than on the one hand considering values as some essentialist concepts, or on the other hand considering values as some kind of subjectivist fantasy. And here I would like to come back to Dewey's proposal in order to study values. Dewey proposes really a kind of third path between these two alternatives, essentialist, subjectivist, in addressing values as valuation as really a practical judgment that is occurring in the interaction between persons and their environment. And I think this is in very strong resonance with the capability approach. What does it mean, addressing values and valuation as Dewey does in terms of practical judgments? Dewey defines valuation as practical judgments through 4 dimensions. The first one is that practical judgments involve incomplete and unfinished situations that require action. That means that the judgment in itself is a factor in the completion of the situation. The second dimension is that practical judgment involve valuation about desired outcomes. That means that it makes a difference how the given is terminated, how the situation is completed. Third dimension, practical judgment is concerned not only with outcomes, not only with ends, it is concerned also with means. That means that practical judgment is always binary. It's always involving an end and means nexus. And therefore, it is also, this is fourth dimension, always involving an empirical inquiry, because the judgment of what is to be done implies knowledge and statement of what the given facts are in a given situation. I see here 4 meaningful supports for social scientists in order to develop inquiring in values and valuations, and in order to make out of values true objects of social inquiries, because I don't have time, but one can easily see that one can decline this 4 dimension in research questions very easily. We can come back to it in the discussion. Then this brings me to the second point, but my time is running out. The logic of inquiry. So this is my second question. What is your inquiry design, your methodological inquiry design? What would be your proposal, Jean-Michel, in order to address this complex phenomena that we call social policies, and that is involving very different levels of social reality? Here I refer to Dewey's logic of inquiry, because Dewey makes out of empirical inquiry a powerful critical lever without any external yardstick for evaluation. But in order to make out of the design of inquiry a lever, a critical lever, some conditions needs to be met. One of these conditions is a multi-level analysis. That means that the critical power of the investigation will result out of the confrontation of different levels of analysis. And when looking at social policies, these different levels, at least the one that come first to mind are institutions, the level of social policies of semantics, that means the level where things are stated as they should be. The second level is the level of organizations, where these things as they should be are implemented. And the third level is the individual level, the level of those who finally experience these things and their outcomes. So this very logic of inquiry and this multi-scale analysis allows to highlight the contradictions, the gaps, the ambivalences you were speaking about between the promises of social policies or the prescriptions of social policies, and finally the means that are available to reach these purposes, as well as the actual achievements that can be reached by these policies. And the second principle is the principle of symmetry. And this is also a very important principle in the pragmatist tradition that has been taken up then later by Bloor. And here, the principle is to confront the point of view of the different stakeholders in a situation. It means that one cannot only understand unemployment by looking at and interviewing unemployed people. And at the same time, one cannot understand unemployment when only looking at institutions and social policies that are concerned with unemployment. The principle of symmetry means that one is interested in the social mechanisms that are making such issues like unemployment. And in order to get access to the social mechanism and not to be stuck at the level of the description of access to resources or not, one needs to take into the board the different stakeholders that make a given issue. So I will stop here. I come to the end of my comment, but I wanted to finish to ask you about the kind of position for the researcher's position, you would associate to the way you conceive of a critical approach to social policies. Combined to critical pragmatism, the capability approach opens for the researcher different ways of getting involved into public debates. The first way is the researcher as a participant being involved in the public debate and in the process of valuation concerning a given subject matter. That means the researcher as any other citizen. And another position is the observer that is giving access to a comprehensive understanding of the contradictions at work in a given field. That means that is more a position where the researcher is not involved himself in the research of social policy solutions. The focus on one or the other position may be more or less strong, but the question is it really worth trying to separate them? And is it useful to search for such a separation? That means I here come back to the distinction between the critical theory and critical pragmatism. Or is in sense positive positional objectivity proposal to bridge this gap between these two different positions of the researcher in critical social sciences and to bridge this gap between critical theory and critical pragmatism.